Welcome to Antisocial Studies. This morning, I read 64 pages of Dr. King's words in 11 speeches or letters over 10 years. Why? Well, he's an incredible writer, 10 out of 10. Also, it's MLK Day, which always feels like a good reason to revisit one of our national heroes, but if I'm being honest, I'm looking for guidance. It's been hard to be a historian over the last few years, watching the news get more and more grim and seeing the similarities to past eras of crisis grow each day. Full transparency, I'd reached a moment of hopelessness. What can I do? What's the point? Are we ever going to be able to right this ship? I looked to Dr. King to find lessons, values to which I can commit myself over the next few years, and I found them. And assuming that you don't also want to read 64 pages of primary sources, which you totally should, by the way, he's really a great writer, I've consolidated them down into 5 points that I'd like to share with you. First, I want to be really clear. This is not new information. I'm not discovering some unique interpretation of Dr. King's words. In fact, Black scholars have been saying all of this for decades. I'm just sharing the lessons that I've found the most helpful in my own journey toward justice. And I'd also like to specifically thank Dr. Ronald Angelo Johnson for literally changing my life as one of my graduate school professors. Thank you for agreeing to teach a Black history summer school class to just 2 white students. Thank you for insisting that we read Du Bois, Howard Thurman, and Dr. King in full, not excerpts or quotes, but like the entire book. I have no idea what that other student is doing now, but you made an impact on me and my worldview that I'm hoping to pass on to others. Before we dive into his words, I also want to mention that throughout Dr. King's writing, there's Christianity. That was the basis of all of his beliefs, and it was a really important base of support for many Black civil rights activists. Even if you're not a Christian, even if you don't believe in God, still listen to his words. The message is still incredibly valuable, and the stories and anecdotes that he tells and the way that he uses his biblical knowledge to convince his audience of the truth of his words, it's beautiful. Okay, let's get to my takeaways. It's actually nice because even though there's a ton to read and understand, my points are all rooted in one simple idea that we can all implement immediately if we're brave enough. It's what Dr. King called dangerous unselfishness. The simplest way that you can make the world a better place is to practice indiscriminate selflessness. No questions asked, no strings attached. Practice kindness through action. Referring to the final judgment day, Dr. King said, "Oh, there will be a day, and the question won't be, how many awards did you get in life? It won't be, how popular were you in your social setting? It will not ask how many degrees you've been able to get. The question that day will not be, how beautiful is your house? The question that day will not be, how much money did you accumulate? How much did you have in stocks and bonds? The question that day will not be, what kind of automobile did you have? On that day, the question will be, what did you do for others?" Somewhere along the way, we must learn that there is nothing greater than to do something for others. And this is the way I've decided to go the rest of my days. That's what I'm concerned about. This statement is going to be my guiding light moving forward. And everything else good stems from the simple idea of doing things for other people. And all of the other changes I hope to make in my own life and in the world cannot happen until I accept that my life is not inherently more important than anyone else's. I'll admit it's a tough one. It's also fairly straightforward. Staring at the problems in the world can feel overwhelming, but the solution is actually quite simple. Get up and do something right now for people who need it. But that's just the first step. Dr. King said, "True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring." Ooh, we're talking about societal change now. So the other answer is building communities. Make yourself a small part of a bigger whole, guided by your values and your desire to be selfless and of service. Selflessness is a necessary step in the fight because the enemy of organizing is selfishness. The good news is that selfishness has weaknesses. By definition, it confines a person to being alone. Oppressors may build alliances or connections, but it's not a community. Those are tools for their own selfish desires. And the only antidote to selfishness and competition and isolation is a community built on selflessness and mutual aid. We're all already connected. It's just a matter of accepting that community, not isolation, is our strength, and it's actually the best way to get through tough times. Dr. King said, "I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Never again can we afford to live with the narrow, provincial, outside agitator idea. Anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered an outsider anywhere within its bounds. And here's another important detail. Your community that you build needs to be intentionally large. Cast a wide net and bring in anyone who shares your core values and vision for the future. Just like we need to be selfless, we need to be inclusive. And in fact, the more diverse, the better. Most human beings have most things in common. And throughout history, the enemy has always been division based on superficial concerns. Selfish people win when everyone is as divided and alone as they are. Dr. King said, "This call for a worldwide fellowship that lifts neighborly concern beyond one's tribe, race, class, and nation is in reality a call for an all-embracing and unconditional love for all mankind." This isn't idealism. It's based on the reality that our entire existence relies on other people. Community and interconnectedness isn't some hippie idea. It's actually the most logical way to live, the most efficient way to build our society, and the best way to go through the world with the least amount of friction. Dr. King said, "We are tied together in life and in the world. And you may think you got all you got by yourself, but before you got here to church this morning, you were dependent on more than half the world. You get up in the morning and go to the bathroom, and you reach over for a bar of soap, and that's handed to you by a Frenchman." Not literally. He's making a metaphor here. You reach over for a sponge, and that's given to you by a Turk. You reach over for a towel, and that comes to your hand from the hands of a Pacific Islander. Before you get through eating breakfast in the morning, you're dependent on more than half the world. That's the way God structured it. That's the way God structured this world. So let us be concerned about others because we are dependent on others. And unfortunately, all of this work is going to lead to discomfort. When you accept that your life isn't more important than others, it gets hard to look away from injustices. Once you open your eyes to the fact that oppression is everywhere, you can't unsee it. Trust me. It's the curse of knowledge. Those who forget history are doomed to repeat it, sure, but those who learn history are doomed to watch it happen. And you and all of us are at a true red pill, blue pill moment. Do you believe me when I say that oppression is a spiderweb that touches everyone's lives? If so, then you have to concern yourself with the oppression of anyone, whether they are in your community, whether they directly connect to your life or not. Dr. King said, "I want to say to you as I move to my conclusion, as we talk about where do we go from here, that we honestly face the fact that the movement must address itself to the question of restructuring the whole of American society. There are 40 million poor people here, and one day we must ask the question, why are there 40 million poor people in America? And when you begin to ask that question, you are raising questions about the economic system, about a broader distribution of wealth. When you ask that question, you begin to question the capitalistic economy. And I'm simply saying that more and more, we've got to begin to ask questions about the whole society. We are called upon to help the discouraged beggars in life's marketplace. But one day we must come to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. It means that questions must be raised. You see, my friends, when you deal with this, you begin to ask the question, who owns the oil? You begin to ask the question, who owns the iron ore? You begin to ask the question, why is it that people have to pay water bills in a world that is 2/3 water? These are questions that must be asked. Whew. We have to start asking questions and allowing ourselves to consider that what we've believed or always assumed to be true might be wrong. That the way things are right now doesn't have to be, or maybe shouldn't be the way they are moving forward. Now, if you reach this point and you're still in, you want to restructure society, as Dr. King put it. You, yes you, are going to have to make sacrifices. And you probably won't be recognized or rewarded for them. Your job when you join larger movements probably won't get your picture in history books. Your role in justice work is probably something quiet and boring and unheroic. You might feel insignificant or like one small cog in a bigger machine, but that's how communities function, and each person's work is important. Dr. King said, "After we've discovered our life's work, we should set out to do that work so well that the living, the dead, or the unborn couldn't do it any better." Now, this does not mean that everybody will do the so-called big, recognized things of life. Very few people will rise to the heights of genius in the arts and the sciences. Very few collectively will rise to certain professions. Most of us will have to be content to work in the fields and in the factories and on the streets. But we must see the dignity of all labor. What I'm saying to you this morning, my friends, even if it falls your lot to be a street sweeper, go on out and sweep streets like Michelangelo painted pictures. Sweep streets like Handel and Beethoven composed music. Sweep streets like Shakespeare wrote poetry. Sweep streets so well that all the host of heaven and earth will have to pause and say, here lived a great street sweeper who swept his job well. And some people in your life are going to question you. They're going to be worried for you and your safety even, which is a beautiful thing because it shows that they love you. But standing up to oppression doesn't just mean giving up some of your time and money. It might mean breaking a law. Dr. King said, we should never forget that everything Adolf Hitler did in Germany was legal, and everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. It was illegal to aid and comfort a Jew in Hitler's Germany. Even so, I'm sure that had I lived in Germany at the time, I would have aided and comforted my Jewish brothers. Joining the fight against oppression might mean that you can't do things you want to do. You might lose opportunities or even put yourself in harm's way. This is the selflessness of sacrifice. Dr. King said, I realize that it will cause restless nights sometimes. It might cause losing a job. It will cause suffering and sacrifice. It might even cause physical death for some. But if physical death is the price that some must pay to free their children from a permanent life of psychological death, then nothing can be more Christian. Keep going today. Keep moving amid every obstacle. Keep moving amid every mountain of opposition. If you will do that with dignity, when the history books are written in the future, the historians will have to look back and say, there lived a great people. People in your life might question you or distance themselves because they think you're taking on too much or exaggerating the extent of the problem. Don't let them gaslight you. It's going to hurt because it means that they don't see what you see. It might disrupt relationships with people who aren't at the same point in their journey as you are. Dr. King said, and when I hear them, though I often understand the source of their concern, I am nevertheless greatly saddened. For such questions mean that the inquirers have not really known me, my commitment, or my calling. Indeed, their questions suggest that they do not know the world in which they live. This work can be incredibly lonely, which is another reason why finding and building community is more important than ever. And in fact, it might be so lonely that you decide to just stay quiet so that you don't rock the boat, or not push so that you don't make other people or yourself uncomfortable. I've done it. I've stepped back to make things easier. But here's the truth. When it comes to oppression, you have to pick a side. And if you stay quiet or don't push, you've already picked a side. Dr. King said there is a dire need today for a liberalism which is truly liberal. What we are witnessing today in so many communities is the sort of quasi-liberalism, which is based on the principle of looking sympathetically at all sides. It is a liberalism so bent on seeing all sides that it fails to become committed to either side. It is a liberalism that is so objectively analytical that it is not subjectively committed. It is a liberalism which is neither hot nor cold, but lukewarm. We call for a liberalism which will be thoroughly committed to the ideal of racial justice and will not be deterred by the propaganda and subtle words of those who say, slow up for a while, you're pushing too fast. Neutrality is a choice. Saying you don't get involved in politics or you don't read the news is a choice. You are choosing to allow the status quo to continue. So I would encourage you to at least get a good idea of what that status quo actually means before you decide that that's the side you're going with. Dr. King said, so the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be. Will we be extremists for hate or for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice or the extension of justice? In that dramatic scene on Calvary's Hill, 3 men were crucified. We must never forget that all 3 were crucified for the same crime, the crime of extremism. 2 were extremists for immorality and thus fell below their environment. The other, Jesus Christ, was an extremist for love, truth, and goodness, and thereby rose above his environment. Perhaps the South, the nation, and the world are in dire need of creative extremists. And if you're watching this and you normally consider yourself a quiet moderate, good news, you actually have the most power to create change. You are the majority, and you are also the group that has, up to this point, engaged the least. You speaking up within your community will do more for the cause than a radical preaching to the choir of their radical community. Dr. King said, I must confess that over the past few years I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you and the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. But thankfully, the continuity through all of Dr. King's words is a radical optimism, and it's not naivete, it's a choice to wake up each day and believe that the world can be a better place, but also to understand that the world becoming a better place is not inevitable. It's based on individual and daily commitments to selflessness, building community, making sacrifices, and being brave. Dr. King said, I am not unmindful that some of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations. Some of you have come fresh from narrow cells. Some of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. You have been the veterans of creative suffering. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. Go back to Mississippi, go back to Alabama, go back to Georgia, go back to Louisiana, go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities, knowing that somehow this situation can and will be changed. You've probably also heard that Dr. King believed we should love our enemies, which I'll admit is the message that I'm struggling the most to commit myself to. But if it helps, he argues that the idea of loving your enemy is more about preserving your own humanity and your own commitment to selflessness. And it's also about making your work and your life more sustainable. Dr. King said, we must never become bitter. I know how we feel sometimes. There is the danger that those of us who have been forced so long to stand amid the tragic midnight of oppression, those of us who have been trampled over, those of us who have been kicked about, there is the danger that we will become bitter. But if we become bitter and indulge in hate campaigns, the new order which is emerging will be nothing but a duplication of the old order. Loving your enemy is not about letting your enemy off the hook. It's about dedicating yourself so much to the idea of community, mutual aid, and dangerous unselfishness that you even find the humanity and possibility of change within those who are currently oppressing you or others. They might never change, but you have no control over that. At least that's what my therapist has been telling me. Loving your enemy allows yourself to deepen your commitment to selflessness, and it leaves you stronger with more energy and optimism to do the work. And finally, as a bonus point, if you're waiting around wondering when the time to choose is going to come, take it from a historian who has spent her entire adult life learning about important moments and times of crisis in the past. It's right now. Dr. King said, more and more I feel that the people of ill will have used time much more effectively than have the people of goodwill. We will have to repent in this generation not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. Human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts of men willing to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the forces of social stagnation. We must use time creatively in the knowledge that the time is always ripe to do right. Or even more bluntly, Dr. King said, we are now faced with the fact, my friends, that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. Procrastination is still the thief of time. We're not on the road to a crisis. We're not heading there. We're here. Oppression is happening, and it always has been, but it's happening on a scale that many of us have been lucky enough to never experience before. And if you wonder what you would have done in past moments of hatred, division, and suppression of rights, you have your answer because you're doing it right now, which in your case is a good thing because at least you watched this video until the end. Educating yourself and confronting uncomfortable truths is the first step, and we need it now more than ever. Thanks for watching.